My brother and I were staying at a cabin in northern Montana, nestled low between the mountains and surrounded by thick trees. Being outdoorsy was kind of our thing, so trips like this weren't unusual for us at all. My brother Johnny and I spent most of our time hiking, wandering through the woods and just exploring whatever we could find. Because the drive had been long and tiring, we didn't do much on the first day. We mostly stayed near the cabin, taking in the scenery and relaxing. Sometime around 5:30, Johnny mentioned he was going to take a quick walk before the sun went down. I barely reacted, just glanced up as he headed out and said, "Okay." He didn't bring a backpack or any gear, so I knew he wasn't planning anything serious. I stretched out on the couch near the fireplace and tried to relax. I was half asleep, worn out from doing most of the driving earlier that day. Slowly, the cabin grew dimmer as the sun slipped behind the mountains. It wasn't until the fire was the only thing lighting the room that I realized Johnny still hadn't come back. By then, it was way too dark to be wandering around the woods without equipment. I jumped up, grabbed my day pack, a headlamp, and a flashlight, and headed outside to make sure he was all right. At first, my mind immediately went to bears. We were definitely in bear country, and that alone made my stomach tighten. But as I walked farther along the trail, that fear shifted into something else entirely. I had this awful feeling creeping over me, like I wasn't alone. I kept turning around, half expecting to see someone standing there behind me. There was nothing. About 10 minutes down the path, I finally saw Johnny heading toward me. Something about him felt off. He wasn't running, but he was moving fast like someone who didn't want to stick around any longer than necessary. We both started talking at once. I was asking him what happened, and he was telling me we needed to turn around and get back to the cabin. Eventually, we gave up talking and just power walked back together. Once we were safely inside, he told me what had happened. Johnny said he noticed a man watching him from the trees. The guy gave him a really unsettling feeling, and as Johnny continued down the trail, it almost felt like the man was following him. He figured that if he went straight back in daylight, the guy might trail him right to the cabin, so he waited until it got dark before leaving. Even though he clearly looked shaken, Johnny tried to brush it off. Being the older brother, he said it was probably nothing and that he'd just rather be cautious than careless. I trusted him and forced myself to let it go. Maybe the guy had a cabin nearby, or maybe he was just another hiker. We cooked dinner and spent the rest of the evening sitting out on the porch by the campfire. I think we were both quietly watching the tree line, even though neither of us said it out loud. As the night went on, the mountains grew completely still. We stayed up talking by the fire until late, then finally went inside and slept. The next morning, after a quick breakfast, we packed up and headed out for the main hike straight up to one of the mountain peaks. It took about 6 hours, and by the time we were done, we were completely drained. That final stretch back to the cabin felt endless. Once inside, Johnny dropped his bag and said he was going to shower. I stayed behind on the couch, waiting my turn since the cabin only had 2 rooms and 1 bathroom. I'd only been lying there for a minute when my mind drifted back to what Johnny had told me the night before. Without really thinking, I stood up and looked out the windows, almost expecting to see someone out there. I went back to the couch, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. Something just felt wrong. A few more minutes passed as I lay there, trying to understand why I felt so uneasy. That's when it hit me. The loud, clunky water pump that always kicked on during a shower was completely silent. "Johnny?" I called out his name. No answer. I stood up and walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. I knocked and said his name again. My chest tightened as I reached for the handle and slowly cracked the door open, just enough to see inside. Johnny was crouched in the corner of the room. His eyes were wide, locked onto mine, and he was lightly shaking his head, telling me, without a word, to leave. The terror on his face was overwhelming. Even now, that image is burned into my mind. I hope I never see fear like that again. I pushed the door open the rest of the way. Standing only a few feet from him was a man. His eyes were wide too, but in a drained, unsettling way. His clothes were torn and filthy, his long black hair greasy and unkempt. He looked completely out of place, like he didn't belong in the real world at all. I didn't think, I didn't plan. I just reacted. I rushed him, and only when I was a couple steps away did I see him lifting a gun from his side. I slammed into him anyway. Johnny instantly sprang into action, and together we fought to get the weapon out of his hands. The man went wild, screaming, screeching, clawing at us like an animal desperate to escape. I had never seen someone behave like that before. He didn't slow down, not even for a second. It took us longer than it should have to figure out what to do next. We decided Johnny, who was much bigger than me, would hold him down while I got the car ready. I ran outside, threw our bags into the car. They were already packed from the hike, and started the engine. Then I rushed back inside. We grabbed whatever we could find and tied him up just enough to buy ourselves time. We took the gun with us and got out of there. As we drove away, we could still hear him screaming from inside the cabin. I think we were both quietly watching the tree line, even though neither of us said it out loud. As the night went on, the mountains grew completely still. We stayed up talking by the fire until late, then finally went inside and slept. The next morning, after a quick breakfast, we packed up and headed out for the main hike straight up to one of the mountain peaks. It took about 6 hours, and by the time we were done, we were completely drained. That final stretch back to the cabin felt endless. Once inside, Johnny dropped his bag and said he was going to shower. I stayed behind on the couch, waiting my turn since the cabin only had 2 rooms and 1 bathroom. I'd only been lying there for a minute when my mind drifted back to what Johnny had told me the night before. Without really thinking, I stood up and looked out the windows, almost expecting to see someone out there. I went back to the couch, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. Something just felt wrong. A few more minutes passed as I lay there, trying to understand why I felt so uneasy. That's when it hit me. The loud, clunky water pump that always kicked on during a shower was completely silent. "Johnny?" I called out his name. No answer. I stood up and walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. I knocked and said his name again. My chest tightened as I reached for the handle and slowly cracked the door open, just enough to see inside. Johnny was crouched in the corner of the room. His eyes were wide, locked onto mine, and he was lightly shaking his head, telling me, without a word, to leave. The terror on his face was overwhelming. Even now, that image is burned into my mind. I hope I never see fear like that again. I pushed the door open the rest of the way. Standing only a few feet from him was a man. His eyes were wide too, but in a drained, unsettling way. His clothes were torn and filthy, his long black hair greasy and unkempt. He looked completely out of place, like he didn't belong in the real world at all. I didn't think, I didn't plan. I just reacted. I rushed him, and only when I was a couple steps away did I see him lifting a gun from his side. I slammed into him anyway. Johnny instantly sprang into action, and together we fought to get the weapon out of his hands. The man went wild, screaming, screeching, clawing at us like an animal desperate to escape. I had never seen someone behave like that before. He didn't slow down, not even for a second. It took us longer than it should have to figure out what to do next. We decided Johnny, who was much bigger than me, would hold him down while I got the car ready. I ran outside, threw our bags into the car. They were already packed from the hike, and started the engine. Then I rushed back inside. We grabbed whatever we could find and tied him up just enough to buy ourselves time. We took the gun with us and got out of there. As we drove away, we could still hear him screaming from inside the cabin. Once we had cell service, we called the police. By the time they reached the cabin, All that was left were the scraps we'd used to restrain him, scattered across the floor. The man was gone. Later, Johnny told me what had happened before I walked in. When he went into the bedroom to shower, the man caught him completely by surprise and held him at gunpoint. He ordered Johnny to call me into the room. Johnny refused. He knew it would give me no chance at all. And yet, somehow, I walked in anyway. We still talk about how insane it was that I charged him. I honestly can't explain it. I just know that split-second decision may have been the reason we made it out of that cabin alive. The only real lead the authorities had came from the gun we handed over. They traced it back to a man who had been reported missing for 5 years from an area about 50 miles away. But based on our description of the attacker, it didn't seem like the same person. That led investigators to believe the man who attacked us may have also attacked the gun's owner and made him disappear. And if things had gone even slightly differently that day, Johnny and I might have ended up the same way. Back in 2016, I decided to make a trip out to my father's old cabin. It sat about 6 hours away, deep in the woods near the place where he grew up. What used to be his hometown wasn't really a town anymore, just a stretch of abandoned buildings and boarded up stores lining an empty road. We rarely ever visited the cabin while he was alive. He always said there wasn't much point once the town died out, but after he passed, I felt drawn to it. I wanted to see the place he built with his own hands. I knew the cabin would probably be in rough condition, but my plan was to do what I could to fix it up, at least enough to keep it standing. More than anything, I hoped the trip would give me some quiet time to think. I made the drive, parked behind an old, crumbling gas station in what was left of the town, and hiked about 2 miles along a narrow, overgrown trail to reach the cabin. I brought full backpacking gear along with a few tools, knowing there was a chance the cabin might not even be there anymore. I was ready to set up a tent if I had to. Thankfully, after the long hike through the trees, I found it still upright. The cabin sat in a small clearing, a simple rectangular structure made of logs, with vines and plants climbing up its exterior. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the place was in terrible shape, trash scattered across the floor and a damp, stale smell hanging in the air. It was obvious someone had figured out the cabin was abandoned and had used it at some point, maybe even lived there for a while. But whatever that presence was, it didn't seem recent. There were no signs of anyone being there within the last couple of years. I shoved what debris I could into one corner, cleared out a spot for myself, and with daylight already fading, unrolled my sleeping bag and settled in for the night. Even though I didn't hear or see anything, I barely slept. I'd drift off for maybe half an hour at a time before waking up with this deep, unsettling feeling. By morning, I was exhausted and seriously questioning whether coming out here had been a good idea. At sunrise, I fired up my small camping stove, made some coffee, and went for a walk to try and shake the feeling. The woods were still dim, the sun just beginning to filter through the trees. After walking a short distance, I came across a hill that rose above the forest canopy. I thought it would be a perfect spot to watch the sunrise, but instead, I noticed something else. From up there, I could see the abandoned town in the distance. And in one of the buildings, there was a light on. It looked like it was coming from a window, though I couldn't tell if it belonged to a house or a store. About a minute later, the light shut off. That immediately made me uneasy. Part of me worried about my car, but more than anything, I was shocked that anyone else might be out here at all. I tried to reason it away. Maybe it was just urban explorers poking around the old town. Strange timing, sure, but not impossible. I stayed on the hill for about an hour, watching the sunrise, then headed back through the woods to start working on the cabin. My first task was sealing and cleaning up the exterior, but the entire time I worked, that same feeling kept creeping back, the one from the night before. Every time I glanced toward the trees, A heavy sense of unease settled over me. It took a while to understand what was bothering me so much, but eventually it clicked. I felt watched. Like I wasn't actually alone out there. I kept working, but I was constantly looking over my shoulder. The idea of someone else being nearby felt impossible. The abandoned town made sense, but out here? Just forest and a rotting cabin. I convinced myself I was just on edge for no clear reason. As the sun began to set, I went back inside and decided to test the old wood stove. Somehow, it still worked perfectly, quickly warming the cabin. I sat beside it, watching the flames dance and listening to the crackling wood. My thoughts drifting between my dad, this strange trip, and life in general. Sometime later that night, the steady crackle of the fire was joined by another sound-sharp pops and heavy crunching coming from the front of the cabin. I froze and listened. Within seconds, I realized it wasn't an animal. Whoever it was moved with purpose, and by the time that thought fully formed, they were already at the door. The wood stove suddenly felt unbearably loud, its noise making it hard to focus on what was happening outside. Then came a knock, and right after that, a voice called out a name that made everything around me feel unreal. He said my father's name. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I stood and moved toward the door in a daze, my thoughts spinning. How could a stranger out here know my dad? Without thinking it through, I called out and asked who he was. There was a pause. I think he realized right then that I wasn't the person he expected. "I'm an old friend of the man who built this place," the voice replied. Was hoping I'd get to see him again. I stepped closer, the urge to open the door growing stronger. For a moment, I just wanted someone to talk to someone who knew my dad, who could share stories about him. But something stopped me. I asked why he was here. He said he lived in the abandoned town. After a brief pause, I told him the truth, that I was the son of the man he was looking for, and that my father had passed away. Silence followed. "I'm really sorry to hear that," he finally said. "Wish I'd gotten to see him one last time." At first, those words felt comforting, but almost immediately, something about the way he said them didn't sit right. There was no real grief in his voice, just something cold and wrong. Before I could respond, he spoke again, almost as if he could sense my hesitation. "Why don't you open the door so we can talk?" he said. "It's freezing out here. Be nice to share that fire." He spoke slowly, but there was an edge underneath his words, a subtle impatience. My instinct screamed that he wasn't being honest. Sure, he knew my dad's name, and he claimed to be from the town my father once lived in, but that didn't prove anything. While I stood there trying to figure out what to say, he asked again. This time, he knocked harder. His tone shifted, losing its warmth. I backed away from the door. "Open up," he said. "You really gonna leave me out here to freeze? That's not what your father would have wanted." My heart started pounding. I reached into my backpack and wrapped my hand around my hunting knife. The man began pounding on the door and shouting, dropping any pretense of being friendly. His words turned threatening. I lost track of how long it went on. It felt endless, like being trapped in a waking nightmare. Then, without warning, he slammed his fist into the door one last time. Moments later, I heard his footsteps retreating, fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat there, listening, waiting, terrified he might return. When morning finally came and there was no sign of him, I packed everything as fast as I could and left the cabin behind. I was incredibly relieved to find my car untouched, still hidden behind the crumbling gas station. I drove straight out of that town and didn't stop until I was far away. I'd gone there hoping for closure, maybe answers, maybe peace. Instead, I left with more questions than ever. I realized I never really knew why my father had left that place. I always assumed it was because the town was dying, that everyone eventually moved on. Now, I'm not so sure. There may have been other reasons he never wanted me to know, and reasons he never brought me back to that cabin. I don't know why that man was still there, what he truly wanted, or how deep his connection to my father really was. But I know this much: his intentions weren't good. And if I had let my emotions take over that night, if I had opened that door, I don't believe I ever would have made it out of that town alive. This happened back in 2014, during a gap year I took from college to travel across the US living out of my car. When I eventually made it to the East Coast, my cousin offered to let me stay at his cabin just south of the Appalachian Mountains. I didn't hesitate to accept. Having a real roof over my head sounded amazing after weeks on the road. The place itself was surprisingly nice. It felt less like a rustic cabin and more like a modern vacation home. Definitely not what you picture when you think of a small log cabin hidden in the woods. Honestly, I was a little shocked my cousin let me stay there for free. I started hauling my things in from the car, making a few trips back and forth. On one of those trips, I noticed someone standing out near the tree line. They were far from the path, just standing there. With nothing else around and only me at the cabin, there was no doubt they were watching me. At first, I tried to rationalize it. I didn't know the area at all. Maybe there were other cabins nearby, hidden beyond the trees. Maybe it wasn't as strange as it felt. I grabbed the rest of my stuff, locked my car, and headed inside. As I closed the door, I glanced back and saw the man still standing there, facing the cabin. I texted my cousin to let him know I'd arrived safely and casually mentioned that someone was outside watching me. I asked if he had any idea who it could be. He replied while I was unpacking, but I didn't check my phone until almost an hour later. By then, the sun had already set. His message made my stomach drop. The cabin sat on 40 acres on his land, completely fenced in. No one else was supposed to be out there. That changed everything. Before that, it had just been odd. Now it felt seriously wrong. I went back to the window to look again, but beyond the glow of the cabin lights, everything was pitch black. I couldn't even see the tree line, just darkness in every direction. I shut the curtains, feeling a chill run through me, and tried to distract myself by putting on a movie and lying down in the bedroom. The movie helped a little, but the uneasiness never fully went away. About an hour in, something caught my attention in the corner of my eye. I turned toward the window and noticed a small gap in the curtains. I thought I saw movement. At first, all I could see was my own reflection in the glass, with nothing but darkness behind it. I got up and started walking toward the window when I suddenly heard footsteps tearing through the grass outside. By the time I looked out, there was nothing to see, just the faint sound of someone running off into the dark. I immediately called my cousin. Looking back, I don't know why I didn't call the police right away, but he told me to do exactly that. I hung up and had an officer on the way within minutes. Considering how remote the cabin was, the officer arrived fairly quickly, but whoever had been watching me was long gone. We both realized there wasn't much he could do. No way to search the woods or track anyone unless the guy came back and stayed long enough. And just like that, I was alone again. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched for the rest of the night. I thought about leaving, but the idea of carrying all my things back to the car, walking in and out of the darkness, felt even worse than staying put. Still, I kept checking the windows again and again, even though I never saw anything. By around midnight or maybe 1 a.m., I was pacing the cabin, checking doors and windows repeatedly, trying to convince myself it was safe to sleep. I think I was just delaying it as long as I could, but eventually, exhaustion won out. I had no choice but to try to rest. I shut off every light in the cabin, went into the bedroom, and locked the door behind me. I told myself the worst of it was probably over. I crawled into bed and eventually fell asleep. maybe half an hour later. But it didn't last. I woke up way too early, so early it immediately felt wrong. The sun wasn't even close to rising, which meant it had to be around 4 in the morning. I'd only been asleep for a couple of hours. Almost instantly, that familiar panic came rushing back. I felt an overwhelming urge to check the cabin again. There was no chance I'd be able to fall back asleep without making sure everything was still okay. I got out of bed, switched on the hallway light, and stood there listening. At first, all I could hear was the wind slamming against the thin windows. I started walking down the hall but didn't make it very far before another sound cut through the noise. A few dull thumps, coming from the far end of the cabin. That end of the building had the kitchen and a small library-style room. I moved a little closer, and in the glow from the hallway light, I saw a shadow shifting near the end of the hall. I froze, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Then the shadow stopped. A few seconds passed. Then it began moving again slowly. And finally, a figure stepped into view at the end of the hallway. Just from his outline, I knew immediately it was the same man I'd seen earlier, the one standing out in the trees watching me. I spun around and rushed back into the bedroom, locking the door behind me. The silence that followed was unbearable. I expected him to run after me, to start banging on the door, to do something. But nothing happened. All I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then, slowly, heavy footsteps moved down the hallway. They stopped right on the other side of the door. The man just stood there. I gripped my phone, wanting to call for help, but terrified that he'd hear me and decide to act faster. Instead, I made a split-second decision. I grabbed my keys, opened the window, and bolted for my car. I didn't look back. I jumped in and took off. When everything was over, the police searched the cabin and found no one. They figured he'd gotten in through a window at the far end of the building where the lock was broken. Whether he broke it himself or it was already damaged, they couldn't say. What chilled me even more was what they found afterward. The bedroom door was open. The lock on it was just one of those simple push-button kinds, which meant he had been ready to come in and likely would have any second. If I'd stayed in that room waiting for police, I don't think I would have gotten out. The creepiest part of all is realizing he was probably there from the moment I arrived. He'd likely been watching the cabin, waiting for someone to show up. What he planned to do? I'm grateful I never had to find out.